Well, it's great to be here and to talk about open access resources. As it turns out, Coase's iconic examples in the problem of social costs were really environmental ones. Noise pollution, air pollution, the straying of cattle onto the farmers' fields, and the sparks from a railroad. And these are all examples of what is commonly referred to as market failure, where private parties in making individual decisions, economic decisions, do not weigh the full social costs of their decisions. And the standard solution to that has been regulation, that is to restrict quantities that would be appropriate if, or that we would observe if all costs were considered. Tax policy, these are the Pigouvian taxes that would raise the costs up to something commensurate with social costs. This was the area that Coase was specifically concerned about. More recently, we have adopted what's often called to a Coasean approach, and that is to cap production or inputs and then allow for the trade of shares in that cap. This is cap and trade and emissions and fisheries and so forth. Or we can subsidize to help bring about mitigation of the costs. We can provide technologies or products that otherwise would be produced in too small amounts or in too limited ways due to the open access problem. Environmental regulation has overtaken standard price and entry controls as the largest share of state and local regulation. It's the most rapidly growing in terms of compliance costs and share budgets. And so this is an area that really matters. And so Coase was right to focus on how to get this, make sure that we're doing the right thing. And what I want to argue is that when these policies are designed to address market failure, due to the difference between private and social costs in decision, we actually turn it into government failure, potentially, and the same problem of social costs exists where there is a disconnect between private and social costs. And what we'll see in a moment is that lobby groups that push for environmental legislation get something they highly value, but they don't have to pay for it. Politicians respond to their lobby pressures and get voting or campaign contributions in return, but they're not the residual claimants of the costs of the policies generally. And agency officials who implement the environmental regulations oftentimes benefit from the regulations, and they also do not assume or internalize the costs. And so there's a disconnect between costs and benefits in the government response. It's very similar to the disconnect between private and social costs that we call market failure. So Coase was critical of this, and he actually argued we want to take policies that maximize social welfare, and it could be the case that the optimal policy would be to do nothing. And so, but yet for many advocates, that is not the optimal. So let's look at transactions costs in environmental regulation. First off, who can argue with the provision of a public good? They're so self-evidently valuable that it just seems wrong to question them. The saving of habitat for polar bears, or the subsidizing of electric cars, such as the Tesla Model S, which all of us in this room drive. They cost $100,000, but you'll get $7,000 back from the federal government, and in California you get another $2,500. And so, but who could question that? These are public goods. But yet these are not valued the same by all parties. Some parties actually value them more than others, and you can imagine for many people, habitat for polar bears is just not on the radar screen, whereas for others it's very important. Environmental policies assign then long-term benefits and costs. And once a policy is put into place and the regulatory structure is implemented, it just does not go away. And so you can think of this really as a stream of long-term benefits, especially if you're an advocate, and a stream of long-term costs, especially if you're a taxpayer. Okay? So you can think of these really as a property right in the sense of assigning long-term benefits and costs through environmental policy. So why would anybody lobby for a public good, since we can all enjoy this at the same time without squeezing out anybody else? Well, advocates who especially value a particular public good, such as the Habitat for Polar Bears, will organize and lobby politicians and agencies to provide the service. Okay, and so they benefit from that. And as I said before, others will be the ones that primarily bear the costs. And you can look at the membership of the most active environmental lobby groups to see the kinds of people that are in those lobby groups. And as Sam Pelsman has taught us, those groups are most effective who are relatively small, homogeneous in preferences, relatively wealthy, highly educated, and vote. Okay? Whereas general taxpayers are an amorphous group that are just not an effective lobbyist to counter this. All right? So right away you can see there's a disconnect between benefits and costs, and this tends to then lead to efforts to get too much of something in the same way that private decision-making under market failure leads to too much exploitation of a resource. So you can think of, really, budgets and the policy space associated with budgets as a public good or as an open access resource. So, as I said, politicians and other government officials make decisions, but they don't generally bear direct costs because they're responding to advocates who can give them campaign contributions and get out the vote. Okay, and while the general costs are borne by the general society. So the tendency will be to do too much of it, and it's very hard to criticize it because these are considered public goods. So costs often are not part of the general discussion. In fact, the Supreme Court right now is considering a case whether or not the EPA should consider costs in some Clean Air Act policy implementations. And so, as I said, this is a type of a social cost. So how can we then, to kind of lead on to Phil's discussion, how can we, in a sense, get back to some of Coase's concerns about maximizing social welfare? Well, one thing, I think it's important that if we have more competition among interest groups, then this will tend to mitigate the problem to some degree. So the whole policy space won't be dominated by a few. But that requires information. And these groups that are the ones that bear most cost, general taxpayers, are notoriously hard to mobilize. And so more information about the costs and the benefits and who specifically benefits and who specifically bears costs of environmental legislation is pretty important. So what's the Coasean takeaway from all of this? Well, private and social costs differ in environmental regulation, just as they differ in many market failure settings. And environmental public goods are public goods, but they're not valued the same by all people. In fact, for some people, they might not be valued at all. And so we should evaluate claims for environmental action as carefully as we evaluate claims for any other government intervention. We should learn or focus on who bears the costs and who primarily benefits, because there are clearly private benefits associated with the provision of these public goods. And that's why I brought up the Tesla example. That's a subsidy that clearly is a private good for certain parties. And how does the incidence of this differ? We know from a lot of evidence in research on collective action with regards to open access problems that we're most successful when when costs and benefits are distributed proportionately. That is, if some parties bear more from mitigation, bear more costs from mitigation than they receive in benefits, they will naturally resist it. If some parties bear more benefits from mitigation than they bear costs, they'll naturally want more of it. And so we get the best alignment, the best responses when there's a commensurate allocation of benefits and costs. This was one reason why Coase was particularly critical of the standard notion that the polluter should pay, okay? Because it isn't necessarily the case that that is an incentive-compatible response. In fact, beneficiaries should pay. Why is that the case? Because beneficiaries who benefit from certain environmental policies also bear commensurate costs, then they will tend to push for, in a sense, the socially maximizing amount of environmental legislation or regulation. So again, how to get this alignment? Well, more information about the incidence of environmental regulation in terms of costs and benefits, and to focus more research attention on this problem, that not all environmental public goods are beneficial in the aggregate. They may be beneficial to certain groups, but they clearly impose costs. And so understanding this process would be help us move forward in the way that Coase argued in his 1960 article, The Problem of Social Cost.